There's a fascinating juxtaposition between the portion of Shemini that we concluded and the portions of Tazria and also Mitzvah, where they both revolve around the idea of what goes in our mouth versus what emerges from our mouth. The end of Parshat Shemini discusses the laws of kosher, what type of food we are allowed to ingest and consume and what we are not. And the Torah dedicates two entire Torah portions, Tazria and Mitzvah, to the laws of tsarat, an ancient form of spiritual affliction, what we call leprosy, but it was a spiritual affliction that our sages have defined as a result of slanderous speech, of negative speech, of lashon hara. Two whole Torah portions dedicated to the idea of being careful with what goes out of our mouth. Fascinating. One Torah portion, actually one small section of one Torah portion for what goes into our mouth, two whole Torah portions regarding the danger and how careful we have to be with the words that emerge from our mouth and its repercussions and subsequent consequences. My friends, these three ideas put together from these Torah portions teach us a very profound lesson. And that is that the words that we say are more powerful than we can even imagine. As a society as a whole, we've come a long way regarding what we put into our bodies. Jewish, religious, or other, people are much more conscientious today about the foods they eat. We've made great strides with mindful eating, organic eating, sustainable food, and for observant Jews, the laws of Kashrut, which are meant to elevate us to be more mindful and to be more conscientious and actually be a holier people by through distinction and differentiating the type of food that we eat. And even the times that we eat, to be mindful of how we eat, as the Ramban, Nachmanides, famously coined the phrase that even when we eat what is permitted, we need to be mindful that we eat it in a holy and productive way. But society has been far less successful, I think we can all agree, by being able to control and master what comes out of our mouth, how we speak to each other, language, proper etiquette, being kind and generous with our speech, that we are a long way from mastering. And so when we look at the juxtaposition between the portions of Shemini leading into Tazria and Mitzvah, we learn a very, very important lesson, and that is that controlling to a certain extent what we eat and how we eat will go a long way to helping us be more thoughtful, more considerate, more compassionate, and more gentle in how we speak as well. There's a beautiful story in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Yuma, that tells us to the degree that the type of food that we eat and the how we eat and when we eat not only affects our psyche and character, but even our children and our unborn children who imbibe their DNA and their character from us. The Talmud tells us that, as you know, on Yom Kippur, we are forbidden to eat or drink. Nevertheless, a pregnant woman or someone who is ill is allowed to eat because a life overrides all considerations of the Torah, and therefore we need to make sure that, God forbid, no one puts their life in danger. The Talmud records a story about a pregnant woman who was tempted to eat on Yom Kippur, and they went to the great Rabbi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi at that time, and they asked him for advice what to do. They were concerned about this pregnant woman who had this desire to eat, and she was a very, very special, observant woman, and they wanted to protect her as best as they could, so they asked this rabbi what his advice. So he said, whisper into her ear that today is Yom Kippur. So they went and they whispered into her ear, today is Yom Kippur, the severity, the awesomeness of the day, to see if that would calm her down. Of course, the Talmud says, if it wouldn't, then she would be allowed to eat. They whispered into her ear, and somehow it resonated on a deep level in her soul, and it gave her the strength and the fortitude to complete her fast of Yom Kippur and keep on going. And the Talmud concludes the child that was born emerged to become the famous Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great rabbis, the great sages of Israel, of the Talmud. What we see from here, the Talmud seems to be pointing out, is what the juxtaposition of the portions of the Torah are not random. The Torah specifically picks up Tazria, about a woman giving birth, and the beginning of our portions about a woman giving birth, and the laws of a yoledet, the laws of a woman after she has given birth, emerge directly from the laws of the types of food that we are allowed to eat and not allowed to eat, and then continue into a third topic, these three topics of the laws of Tzara'at. The Torah is suggesting that if we are careful about what we eat according to the laws of the Torah, then the type of children leading into Tazria that we have will carry on in many ways the values of their parents, of their discipline, of their etiquette, of their mindfulness, will be transferred into the children as well. And then we will be saved from the terrible and most ubiquitous problem that plagues society today, and that is Lashon Hara and Rechilot, mindless, negative babble, gossip, and speech that tears down and breaks people apart. And so, Rabbi Chaim Vital, the foremost disciple of the Arizal, tells us this unbelievable, fascinating, and most profound idea. He says, we always read these Torah portions around the holiday of Passover, either in the weeks immediately preceding Passover or just after Passover, but they are always read in proximity to the Passover holiday. And he shares with us this fascinating idea that every Jewish holiday has a particular organ or body part which it addresses and tries to refine and elevate. He says Rosh Hashanah, for example, is all about elevating our capacity of hearing. That is why the blessing we hear, what is the main mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah? It's to hear the shofar. Lishmoa kol shofar is the blessing that we make, to hear the shofar, elevating the way we hear things. Yom Kippur is about teshuvah. As we know, the Talmud tells us teshuvah is primarily a function of the heart, to transform our heart into being a finer, holier, and penitent person. Sukkot, what is the mitzvah of Sukkot? Ulakachtam lachem, you shall take. We shake the species with our hands. The Talmud tells us one must hold the lulav and etrog with their hands. So sitting in the sukkah and lifting the lulav and etrog with your hands, it's an elevation of the way we use our hands to do holy things. Hanukkah, what do we do on Hanukkah? What's the blessing on Hanukkah when we sit by the candles? Eyesight. We gaze at the Hanukkah candles and we say, we don't do anything. We're not allowed to use the lights of the menorah for anything. Ella lir'otan bilvad, to gaze at them. Hanukkah is about purifying our sight. Comes along Pesach, he says, what is the mitzvah directed of Pesach? It's our mouth. The word Pesach is a composite of two words, he says. Pe-sach. Pe means mouth, sach to talk. As a matter of fact, he says, the two primary commandments that revolve around Pesach are, number one, eating the matzah, drinking the 4 cups of wine, and eating the maror. What is the main function of the Seder of Pesach? It all involves and revolves around our mouth, the eating and the drinking of the mitzvah prescribed by the Torah. The second and equal mitzvah that we do at the Seder, that's mentioned numerous times in the Torah, is to tell the story. V'higada talabincha, to tell your children the story. Or as we say in the Haggadah, not only is telling the story, keep talking and talking. There's no holiday on the Jewish calendar that encourages us to talk, and not only to talk, v'chol hamarbe, l'saper, whoever talks the most, harei zeh meshubach, the Haggadah says. If you talk a whole night, you can talk until the next morning. And the more you talk and talk and talk about the story of Pesach, the more praiseworthy and the more you are lauded. Every other holiday, you can keep your mouth closed. You do the mitzvah. There's no mitzvah to talk about it. Pesach is all about using your mouth to talk. Think about the lesson of these Torah portions that we just emerged from. Shemini, how we use our mouth to be careful about what goes in, affects not only what goes out, as they say, what goes in is also the energy that goes out, But this week's Torah portion, which tells us that the sacredness of our children is in large part dependent upon how we behave ourselves and are careful with the type of food that we eat, and how we are mindful affects the fetus and affects the sensitive years of the growing of the child, that when they see what's important to their parents, they have that discipline as well. And ultimately, the Torah dedicates practically 2 entire Torah portions to be just as careful, if not more careful, because it is much more difficult to control what comes out of your mouth than what goes into your mouth. What goes into your mouth, the Torah gives us in a few paragraphs. What goes out of your mouth, the Torah records in several Torah portions. And as I mentioned, as we see, that as a society, as a world, we've come a long way in being mindful and careful about what we ingest, but we have not been successful, to say the least, about controlling our gossip culture that we live in, our social media culture that we live in, where we are obsessing about gossip, about our own gossip, somebody else's gossip, and we know the disastrous effects that this has. And that's why in the time of the temple, in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, the consequences were so profoundly overwhelming, to the degree that a person suffered physically, not only on their skin, on their clothes, on the walls of their home, because how disastrous negative speech or even idle speech can be. And what comes of this? God gives us the holiday of Pesach to transform our ability to use our mouths and to use our words in a holy and profound and productive way. And so as we come into this time surrounding Pesach and we read these Torah portions, let us be mindful. Let us understand what is it that Torah tells us. The Torah groups these Torah portions on purpose to tell us that A equals B equals C. It starts from being careful about what you eat. But just because of that we cannot stop there. We have to make sure that what comes out of our mouths matches the same discipline that we take. And when we look at a container, whether it's for the supervision, the kashrut, or the calories, or the gluten, and we're so careful about that, let us measure every word that comes out of our mouth with the same distinction, with the same care, and make sure that the words that come out of our mouth are holy. And if we do, Pesach comes and teaches us, Pesach, the same mouth that can talk about nonsense, that can talk about even destructive things, that God gives us the energy and the power as a new people. When we come into our exodus, we come into freedom. Freedom is not only a privilege, it's an awesome responsibility. And it tells us that the words that we speak have power. So the Pesach, the words that we speak, whether it is the food that we eat on Pesach that transforms us from the inside, or we stay up a whole night and we use our mouths to tell the story of Pesach, and we pray and we ask God to give us, as we say every time we pray the Amidah, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, God, open our lips, Ufi Yagiti Latecha, put the proper words, put the proper language, even when we are not praying, when we are just talking, when we are going through our day. May God bless us, that we should be able to have the control and the discipline, and indeed the holiness, to be able to master our words and not let our mouth and our words master us. Shabbat Shalom.